Chapter 1. The Indian Guide. When North America still belonged to both Great Britain and France, there was war between their two armies. The land between the head of the Hudson River and the nearby lakes saw some fierce fighting. Lake Champlain started in French Canada and ended in British land, where it was joined by Lake Horican. From Lake Horican, it was a journey of only a few miles over land to the Hudson River, and from there you could sail to the sea. So the French were interested in winning this land, and the British wanted to keep it. Important battles were fought here, and many forts were built here too. Our story begins in the third year of this war. One day in the middle of the summer, a fierce-looking Indian runner arrived at Fort Edward, the British fort at the south of the land route that went from Lake Horican to the Hudson River. He brought news that the French general, Montcalm, was crossing Lake Champlain with a huge army. He also brought a message from General Monro, the old Scottish officer commanding Fort William Henry, which stood on Lake Horican, asking for reinforcements to help him to fight against Montcalm. General Webb, the commander of Fort Edward, had 5,000 soldiers under him, and he decided to send 1,500 men as reinforcements to General Monro the next day. Early the next morning, the soldiers marched north out of the fort, traveling along the wide army road towards Fort William Henry. That same day, another smaller group of people was also getting ready to travel to Fort William Henry. There were 3 fine horses waiting outside General Webb's house, and a small crowd of people stood watching them. Among this crowd was a very strange person. He was tall and thin, with a large head and huge feet. He wore a sky-blue coat, yellow trousers tied at the knee, white cotton stockings and shoes, an old dirty shirt, and a large black hat. While he watched, 3 figures left General Webb's house. A young officer was followed by 2 young women dressed in fine traveling clothes. The younger of the 2 was fair, with blue eyes. She smiled at the officer as he helped her onto her horse. The other woman, whom the officer also helped onto her horse, was beautiful too, but a little older. She wore a green scarf and had fine black hair and dark eyes. It was hard to think that the 2 women were sisters. One was so fair, and the other was so much darker. Finally, the officer climbed onto his own horse, and the 3 rode off, following the Indian runner. As they left, the fair-haired woman pointed at the Indian and began to talk to the officer riding at her side.
"Are there many men like him in the forests here, Duncan?"
she asked Major Hayward.
"He's a little frightening."
"Don't worry, Alice. Mago is just an army runner. He's promised to be our guide and to take us to Fort William Henry by a shorter, secret path through the forest."
"I don't like the look of him, Duncan,"
replied Alice.
"but I suppose that if you know him, he must be all right."
"Well, I know that he used to be on the side of the French. In fact, I believe your father punished him some years ago, although I don't remember much about it. But now he's a friend of the British, and that's good enough for me."
"My father's enemy in the past?"
said Alice.
"I like him even less."
At that point, the Indian runners stopped and pointed to a narrow path that disappeared into the forest.
"Here's our path,"
said Major Hayward.
"What do you think, Cora?"
asked Alice.
"Shall we travel on slowly but safely with the army, or go this way on our own?"
"Alice, we won't be safer with the army,"
said Hayward.
"If we go with them, our enemies will know where to find us easily. This secret route will be much quicker and safer."
"Can we not trust a man with dark skin, Alice?"
added Cora coldly. So they left the wide road and entered the forest, following the Indian guide. They had not gone far before they heard something crashing through the forest behind them, getting closer. They turned and waited until at last they could see what was making all the noise. The strange man in the blue coat, yellow trousers, and white stockings appeared, riding a young horse towards them. Hayward smiled, and Alice and Cora were also amused to see him.
"Are you looking for someone?"
asked Hayward.
"Yes,"
replied the stranger.
"My name is David Gammett. I am a singing teacher. I hear you are traveling to Fort William Henry, and I'd like to come with you."
"The road is there, behind you, sir,"
replied Hayward.
Oh, Duncan, please let him come with us,
said Alice to Hayward, and she looked at Cora and the Indian guide who was standing close by her.
Perhaps we'll need him later.
"Very well,"
replied the Major, and he rode over to Cora. All four riders now turned and followed their Indian guide through the trees. David Gammett sang as they went. Not one of them realized that there were Indians hiding behind bushes in the forest, watching their every step. At a river's edge, two men were talking. One was an Indian, the other a white man, whose skin was dark from the sun, and who was wearing clothes made from animal skins.
"Tell me about the old times, Chingachgook,"
said the white man.
Hawkeye, my friend, we were happy before the white man came here. The lake gave us fish, the sky gave us birds, and the forest gave us animals to eat. Then the Dutch came and gave our people firewater to drink, and we gave our lands to them. Slowly the white men killed us one by one. Now our tribe is nearly gone. Only I and my son Uncas are left, and when I die, Uncas will be the last of the Mohicans.
Out of the forest, another younger Indian came to join them.
"Father,"
he said,
"I come from the forest where the Hurons are hiding. There are white men riding this way."
They are your brothers, Hawkeye. You should speak to them,
said Chingachgook to the white man. At that moment, Hayward rode out of the forest at the river's edge. Cora, Alice, Gammett, and their Indian guide were some 50 steps behind him.
"Who goes there?"
called Hawkeye, picking up his rifle.
"Friends of the British King.
Replied Hayward.
Are we on the right path for Fort William Henry?"
"The right path,"
laughed Hawkeye.
"The wrong path is what you mean. The road to William Henry is behind you."
"Yes, but our Indian guide was taking us on a secret path through the forest. He got lost, so I put him at the back."
"A lost Indian,"
said Hawkeye.
"I can't believe that. Although it's true that you're going the wrong way. Where's he from?"
"He's a Huron from the north, but friendly to the British."
Chingachgook and Uncas jumped up at these words.
"Never trust a Huron,"
said Hawkeye.
"I don't mind who his friends are. I'm surprised that you haven't had more trouble from him. There are more Hurons hiding in this forest, you know. But wait a moment. Chingachgook and Uncas will catch him, and then we can question him."
Silently, Hawkeye's Indian friends disappeared into the bushes. A moment later, Cora, Alice, and Gammett rode from between the trees to join Hawkeye and Hayward, while Magua stopped at the edge of the forest. Hayward got off his horse and went over to speak to him.
"Why did we come this way, Magua? We're lost. This Englishman here tells me that you are a very bad guide."
"Then Magua will leave you here in the forest."
"But what will the Scottish chief of Fort William Henry say then? He will be very angry to hear that Magua left his daughters with no guide."
Suddenly, there was a noise of a breaking branch, and like a frightened animal, Magua ran off into the forest. Uncas and Chingachgook jumped from the bushes and chased him, and Hawkeye lifted his rifle to his shoulder and shot after him. But Magua had already disappeared into the trees. Chapter 2. Behind the Waterfall. Seeing Hawkeye run after Magua, Hayward also began to chase him. But soon he met the White Scout, together with Chingachgook and Uncas, walking back through the forest.
Did you find him?
Asked Hayward.
How can a cloud catch the wind?
Replied Hawkeye.
I shot him at least.
He went on, pointing to the blood on the ground.
Shall we go after him?
Asked Hayward.
And let him lead us to the Hurons or to Montcalm?
Asked Hawkeye.
No. We should leave this place at once. And let us cover our tracks so the Hurons cannot follow us.
I'll pay you well to take us to Fort William Henry,
said Hayward. Hawkeye and his 2 Indian friends talked together in low voices in Mohican. At last, Hawkeye turned to Hayward.
Keep your money. The Mohicans and I will help you and the 2 young ladies to escape to safety. We want no money, but you must promise 2 things. The first is to keep as still and silent as the forest, and the second is never to tell another living person the way to our hiding place.
Agreed,
said Hayward, and he went to explain the plan to Cora and Alice.
What can we do with the horses?
Hawkeye asked himself.
We can't let them go free, or the Hurons will find them and know that we're near. 3 of the horses are old and will keep quiet if they must, so we can take them with us. But the singing teacher's horse is young and noisy. We will have to kill it and throw it into the river.
He turned to Uncas.
Take that young horse,
he began.
Stop!
Cried Gamut.
Keep your hands off my horse!
Listen,
explained Hawkeye.
All our lives are in danger. If you want your horse to live, we'll leave you here for the Hurons. Or think again and let Uncas do what has to be done.
Gamut fell silent, and Uncas and Chingachgook killed the young horse. They then led the other horses into the river and began to walk up it, against the current. From a hiding place under some bushes, Hawkeye pulled a canoe, and Alice and Cora sat in it. With Hayward standing in the water on one side of the boat, and Hawkeye on the other, they moved after Gamut, who followed the Mohicans. After some time, they reached a lonely place where high walls of rock, with trees on top, stood tall and wild on either side of the running water. In front of them was another high rock wall with caves in it. Down this ran a noisy waterfall. In this narrow valley, the Mohicans left their horses tied to some bushes at the edge of the water. At the same time, Hawkeye, Hayward, and Gamut got into the canoe with Cora and Alice. Then Hawkeye steered the little boat straight towards the waterfall. After trying several times, at last the canoe landed in still water by a flat rock at the center of the waterfall.
Here we are, at Glenn's waterfall,
said Hawkeye. Hayward, Cora, Alice, and Gamut got out of the canoe and waited on the rock while Hawkeye steered it back to get Uncas and Chingachgook. Soon they returned and took the food and blankets which they had brought with them from the bottom of the canoe. After that, the Mohicans and the White Scout disappeared into a cave in the rock, and the others followed. Soon a fire was burning, and the smell of cooking meat filled the air.
Uncas,
said Hawkeye,
put 2 blankets up to cover both entrances of the cave. We don't want the Hurons to see the light of our fire. And now,
he went on, turning to the others,
sit and eat. There's salt to add taste if you need it.
After supper, Gamut and the ladies sang. Then they suddenly heard a ghostly cry from outside the cave. What was it? The men went outside into the night to listen.
I think it's the horses,
said Hayward as the cry came again.
Something's frightening them. But is it Hurons or wolves?
Well, at least the cry is no longer a mystery,
said Hawkeye.
And now I think we men should watch while the young ladies sleep for a while.
Cora and Alice slept in the cave. At one entrance sat the Mohicans and Hawkeye. Hayward and Gamut sat at the other and were soon asleep. At the first light of day, Hawkeye woke them quietly. Hayward went at once to get Cora and Alice. Suddenly they heard cries from outside. From the far side of the river, Huron rifles shot at Gamut where he stood at the cave mouth, and he fell to the ground, hitting his head on a rock. Hayward quickly ran and pulled him into the cave, while Hawkeye shot and killed one of the Huron gunmen. Cora looked at Gamut, lying white-faced and still on the floor of the cave.
Is he dead?
She whispered.
No, he was lucky, but he needs to rest,
said Hawkeye. He and Hayward took their rifles and hid in some bushes at the water's edge. After some time, they noticed a Huron at the top of the waterfall above them. Before their eyes, the current pulled him to his death in the river below. Then 4 more Hurons appeared and climbed down from the top of the waterfall towards them. Hawkeye's rifle killed the first. Then Uncas came out of the cave to help them. He killed one Huron and came to help Hayward, who was wrestling with another at the edge of the waterfall. Moving quickly, Uncas cut the wrist of Hayward's enemy, and he fell back into the white water and was pulled under. Hawkeye killed his man with a knife through the heart. Then, from a tree at the top of the wall of rock on the other side of the river, a Huron fighter began shooting down at them. They lay low in the bushes and waited. At last, Hawkeye managed to shoot up into the tree, and the Huron fell to his death on the rocks in the river below.
My last bullet,
said the scout.
Let's fetch more from the canoe.
But they found that the Hurons had cut the ropes and stolen the canoe. They went back to the cave to talk.
What can we do now?
Asked Hayward.
Nothing,
replied Hawkeye.
We are dead men.
No,
said Cora.
You mustn't die. You must leave us here and go to Fort William Henry.
And what shall we say to your father?
Asked Hawkeye.
Tell him to come at once with an army to save us.
A few minutes later, Hawkeye, Chingachgook, and Uncas dropped into the river and swam off, leaving Cora, Alice, Hayward, and the sleeping Gamut in the cave. Chapter 3. Magua's Plans. Now that Hawkeye and the Mohicans had swum off, Hayward looked around him. For the moment, everything was calm. Gamut came out of the cave, holding his aching head. He was still feeling weak from the bad knock he had when he fell against the rock.
What's happening?
He asked.
The Hurons have gone, for a while at least,
replied Hayward.
Let's hide in the cave and hope that they don't find us.
So the soldier and the singing teacher went into the cave. Cora sat there bravely, but Alice was crying.
Alice,
said Hayward,
we are alive, and with life, there's hope.
Yes,
replied Alice, looking up at him.
and all my hopes are with those brave men who are going to fetch our father.
Hayward then took some branches and put them one on top of the other to hide the passage that joined the larger and smaller parts of the cave. Using Hawkeye's blankets, he filled the holes between the branches, and soon their part of the cave was dark, lit only by the weak light that came through the narrow second entrance at the side of the cave. Taking his gun and his last few bullets in his hand, he turned with a grim face to watch the narrow cave entrance.
The Hurons won't find us easy to capture,
he said to himself.
Well now, shall we sing a little?
Said Gamut bravely. He took a little songbook out of his pocket and began to sing.
Isn't singing dangerous with the Hurons so close?
Cora asked.
Poor man,
replied Hayward.
His voice is so weak, I honestly don't think that the Hurons will hear it.
But only a short while later, David Gamut's song was interrupted by a Huron cry just outside the main entrance to the cave. All eyes turned to the thin wall of branches and blankets that stood between them and their enemies. Hayward lifted up the corner of a blanket to see what was happening in the main part of the cave. The Hurons were there. One man held Hawkeye's useless rifle, and they seemed to be looking for the White Scout everywhere. But apart from seeing some of David Gamut's blood on the cave floor, which excited them greatly, they found nothing of interest to them. Hayward, Gamut, and the two Monroe sisters kept silent, and hoped that the Hurons wouldn't discover their secret hiding place behind the branches. At last the Huron fighters left the main cave, and their cries grew fainter as they went off to explore the rest of the rocky island. Hayward turned to his friends.
They've gone,
he said. Alice opened her mouth to say something, but suddenly her eyes widened and she screamed. Hayward turned to look at the side entrance of the cave. There, against the light, he saw the dark figure of Magua. Without thinking, he shot at the man, but Magua ran off to safety, and the noise of the gun immediately brought the Hurons back to the cave. The wall of branches and blankets was quickly pulled to pieces, and Hayward, the Monroe sisters, and Gamut were led out into the daylight. The Hurons stood all around them, angrily shouting at them in French, and sometimes talking together in their own language. One of them, a tall, strong man, seemed in Hayward's eyes to be their chief. He called Magua to him and spoke to him for a few minutes. Then Magua came over to the prisoners and explained what the others were saying.
They are looking for the White Scout long rifle,
he said, using the Indian's name for Hawkeye.
And his Mohican friends, Chingachgook and Uncas. Where are they?
They swam off down the river,
replied Hayward with a grim smile.
You'll never catch them now.
Magua explained Hayward's words to the other Hurons, who looked angry. Then the Huron chief spoke. From time to time, he pointed towards Fort Edward, and Hayward felt sure he was worried that General Webb would attack them. After the chief had finished, Hayward, Gamut, and the women were marched to the riverbank, where a canoe was waiting. They got in, and 2 Hurons got in after them. In moments, the current took them back to the place where they had entered the river with Hawkeye and the Mohicans the day before. They got out on the other bank. Soon the Huron chief arrived on Hayward's horse, followed by the rest of the Hurons and the other horses. They left Magua and 5 other Indians with the prisoners, and rode off towards Fort William Henry. Hayward spoke to Magua, who was standing under a tree.
You were clever to pretend to join the French, although you are still a true friend of the British. But when will you get rid of these others and lead us to General Monroe? He will give you many presents for bringing his daughters to him.
Send the dark-haired woman here to speak to me,
replied Magua, playing with a small tomahawk in his hand. Hayward led Cora to him. Like Alice and Gamut, her wrists were now tied with rope. Instead of leaving Cora and Magua alone, Hayward stood not far off, watching. Another Huron came to stand at Magua's side.
What do you wish to say, Magua?
Cora asked their former guide.
Only this. Your father had me beaten one day for drinking firewater, and I cannot forget that. I was a chief among my people before I came to live here, and you do not beat a chief.
He looked down at his tomahawk.
And why are you telling me this?
Asked Cora.
Because you can help your sister and your friends. I will take them to your father if you promise me something.
What?
Asked Cora, her blood running cold.
You will become my wife. You will live with me. You will sleep in my bed and cook my food for me. Then General Monroe will not make war against my people again, because my knife will never be far from his daughter's neck.
Cora looked at him angrily.
Never!
She cried. At that, Magua threw his tomahawk angrily at the tree just beyond where Cora stood, and the Indian at his side pulled out his knife. But before he could use it on Cora, Hayward ran between them and wrestled him to the ground. The Indian was stronger than the young soldier, and soon he was on top and winning the fight. He lifted his knife in the air, hoping to drive it down into Hayward's heart. Then suddenly, there was a rifle shot, and the Huron fell dead at Hayward's side. Chapter 4. Safe Again. It shocked Magua and the other Hurons to see one of their number die so suddenly. There were cries of "Long Rifle." The dead man was wrestling with Hayward when he was shot. Hawkeye was the only gunman they knew who could safely shoot one wrestling man and miss the other. Almost immediately, Hawkeye appeared with his rifle from behind some bushes, together with Uncas, who was holding his tomahawk. Chingachgook also came forward and ran towards Cora. Hawkeye hurried forwards, not stopping to put fresh bullets in his rifle, but using it to beat his enemies. Magua picked up a knife and ran to meet Chingachgook. And the three other Hurons got ready to fight Hawkeye and Uncas. Hayward pulled Magua's tomahawk from the tree and ran to join them. Now it was Magua and his three friends against Hayward and his three. Hayward threw Magua's tomahawk at one of the Hurons. It hit the Indian on the head, and this stopped him for a while. But when Hayward ran forward and began to wrestle with him, he realized that the man was not badly hurt and was still fighting strongly. He was saved by Hawkeye, who brought his rifle down hard on the Huron's head and killed him. Uncas, who had just killed another Huron fighter with his tomahawk, now ran to help Cora, who had untied the rope around her wrists and was trying to untie Alice. From behind them, a Huron quickly caught the older sister by the hair and pushed her to the ground, lifting his knife in the air to kill her. But Uncas jumped on him, and Hayward and Hawkeye were not far behind. Soon, the Huron lay dead at Cora's feet. Now Hayward, Hawkeye, and Uncas ran back to see the fight between Chingachgook and Magua. The two figures wrestled fiercely on the ground at the edge of a slope, their knives bright in the sunlight. And Hayward, Hawkeye, and Uncas looked on, unable to help for fear of hurting Chingachgook. Then, suddenly, Chingachgook drove his knife forward, and Magua fell back, still and silent. At last he was dead, it seemed. Chingachgook began to dance and sing a song of victory. Hawkeye lifted his rifle in the air in order to bring it down hard on Magua's head. But before he could do anything, the Huron suddenly came to life, rolled down the slope, and ran off to safety in the forest.
What a dishonest man,
said Hawkeye.
He couldn't even die bravely. Well, let him go. He has no knife, and he's far from his French friends. He's no danger to us now.
Cora untied Alice's wrists, and Hawkeye did the same with David Gamut. They found Cora's and Alice's horses tied to trees at the foot of the slope, together with some deer meat that the Hurons had caught, ready to eat. There was a spring nearby, so they all stopped for a drink. Then Uncas found wood, made a fire, and began to cook the meat. And at the same time, Hawkeye told Hayward of their adventures.
We had no time to reach the fort and return to save you. So instead, we hid in the forest, followed your tracks, and waited until the right moment to attack.
After they had drunk some water, eaten some meat, and rested, the two sisters got on their horses, and with Hawkeye, Hayward, Gamut, and the Mohicans walking at their side, they moved off towards Fort William Henry. Towards late evening, they reached a number of tall trees that stood in a circle. Thick bushes grew between them.
If I remember rightly, there's an old wooden house in the middle of those trees,
said Hawkeye.
It's a place where we can rest for a while, safe from attack. Then, when the moon is in the sky, we must travel on.
So the group of travelers passed between the trees and up the hill which stood beyond them. The roof of the house had fallen in, but Hawkeye, Uncas, and Chingachgook entered the walls and looked around with interest. Hayward, Gamut, and the Monroe sisters followed them.
Chingachgook and I built this house years ago to be safe from attack during a war between the Mohicans and another tribe,
went on Hawkeye.
I fought here, and of all the Mohicans who built this house, he and I were the only men alive at the end of the fight. The dead lie under the grass outside.
Some stones marked the place where the dead man lay, and Cora and Alice looked at the place sadly. Then they all drank from an old spring near the house, and beds were made from dry leaves for the two sisters. Everyone was tired, and only the two Mohicans stayed awake to guard the house from attack. Later, they woke up to hear men walking towards their hiding place. The Mohicans brought the horses into the house, and they waited to see what was going to happen. Looking out of a dark window, Hayward saw about 20 Hurons coming through the trees. Suddenly, they pointed to the stones where the dead Mohicans lay, and turned around and walked away again.
They fear the ghosts of the dead,
said Hawkeye. When they were sure the Hurons had gone, Hawkeye led the others out of the house towards Fort William Henry. Later, from the top of a hill, they looked down into a valley. There, by moonlight, they could see Fort William Henry. Around it lay Montcalm's army.
I hope we are not too late,
said Hayward worriedly. A thick fog came down, but they traveled on. After some time, Hawkeye told Cora and Alice to get down from their horses and leave them in the forest.
It's safer to walk now,
he explained. Then they suddenly heard someone marching towards them.
Qui va là?
Asked a voice in French.
Who goes there?
Un ami de la France,
answered Hayward.
A friend of France.
But the French soldier began shooting, and other Frenchmen joined him. Hawkeye, Hayward, Cora, Alice, Gamut, and the Mohicans ran away from the bullets and disappeared into the fog. At last, a tall wooden building appeared in front of them.
Shoot when they get close,
came a voice from the top of the wall.
Father! Father, don't shoot! It's Cora and me!
Called Alice.
Don't shoot, men!
Cried General Monroe.
Open the door for my daughters. With them here, I will fight on even more bravely than before.
Chapter 5. The Siege of Fort William Henry. General Monroe welcomed Cora, Alice, and Hayward to Fort William Henry. Hawkeye and the Mohicans left at once on other business. The fort was surrounded by the French and the Hurons. They attacked day and night with big guns, and still there was no word of the reinforcements promised by Webb. But under Monroe's command, and with Hayward as second in command, the British soldiers were unafraid. The French siege of William Henry went on for 5 days. On the 5th day, both commanders called a truce, and the fighting stopped for a while. During this time, Hayward took a walk along the high slope where the British guns stood outside the fort walls. He was surprised to see a French soldier walking along the path that led from Montcalm's camp to the fort. The man had a prisoner with him, and Hayward saw that it was Hawkeye. His face was grim, his wrists were tied behind his back, and he had no rifle. Hayward turned and made his way to Monroe's rooms at Fort William Henry. He thought that the French had caught Hawkeye returning to the fort, and wondered why he had returned so soon. Perhaps Monroe would know. On his way, he met Cora and Alice, who made fun of him for not spending much time with them.
I am sorry,
he smiled.
I do your father's business, as a soldier should. You cannot think badly of me for that.
Of course not, Duncan,
said Alice.
In fact, my sister and I are very grateful to you for bringing us here, aren't we, Cora?
Replied Cora sadly.
But what will happen now? These are hard times for our father. How will this siege end?
In victory for the British, I hope,
replied Hayward, and he kissed Alice's hand, and then hurried on to Monroe's room.
Hayward,
said Monroe, opening his door.
I wanted to talk to you.
About the message from the French, sir?
Yes. But let the Frenchman wait a little. Is it true that you are in love with one of my daughters?
Yes,
answered Hayward.
But I haven't told Alice yet.
Alice, you say? Do you have something against my Cora? Is it her dark skin? I met Cora's mother, my first wife, while I was fighting for the king in far-off lands. Her great-grandparents came from Africa. Do you find that so ugly?
No, sir,
replied Hayward.
It is only that Alice's smiling eyes and her happy laugh captured my heart first.
When Cora's mother died, I returned to Scotland. Alice is the fair daughter of my second wife, who died when she was born,
went on Monroe to himself, his face full of sadness. Then he became calm and businesslike.
Now let us talk of the scout Hawkeye. He was returning from Fort Edward, but the French have taken him prisoner.
And are Webb's reinforcements coming?
Asked Hayward.
I have no word from Hawkeye of that,
answered Monroe.
But he was bringing a letter from Webb, which I'm sure explained everything. Montcalm has it now, of course. But if it brings bad news for us, why does Montcalm not tell us? Is that why he asks me to go and talk with him?
What will you do, sir? The fort walls cannot stand much longer against the siege, and many of our guns are useless.
I won't leave this fort while there is hope of help from Webb. Let us meet Montcalm and find out what we can.
Sometime later, Monroe and Hayward marched out of the fort at the head of their men to meet the French commander. Both sides stopped and stared for several minutes. Magua was there among Montcalm's men.
"So you come to talk of peace,"
began Montcalm.
"My scouts tell me that you cannot hold the fort much longer. The time to be brave has passed. Think of the safety of your men now."
Have your scouts not also seen General Webb's reinforcements, which are on their way to us?
"Let General Webb himself explain things,"
replied Montcalm, and he brought out an open letter from his pocket and put it into Monroe's hand. Monroe read it, and his face went gray.
Sir, it is impossible for me to send even one man to you. The best thing for you to do is to leave Fort William Henry as quickly as possible. Yours, Webb. It's Webb's writing,
said Hayward, reading it.
It must be the captured letter.
We won't leave. We'll fight to the death,
said Monroe.
"Wait,"
interrupted Montcalm.
"The King of France is fair. You are brave, but there is no need to die. You can leave the fort with your men, women, and children, your flags and guns, and my army will let you go."
I accept what you offer,
said Monroe, and he turned to Hayward.
It is strange to find an English coward and an honest Frenchman in one day.
The next day, 3,000 British left Fort William Henry, with Monroe at the head of the line, a broken man. Hayward asked David Gamut, the singing teacher, to ride with Cora and Alice at the back of the line with the other British women and children from the fort. On one side of them stood the French army. On the other, the Hurons watched and waited. When the British army had crossed the open ground in front of the fort and entered the forest, the Hurons came near the women and children. Magua was with them. Suddenly, one of the Hurons took hold of a baby and pulled it from its mother's arms. She screamed and tried to get her child back, but he threw the baby to the ground and pulled out his tomahawk to attack and kill the mother. This was how it began, the terrible massacre of the British women and children by the Hurons that day, and the French did nothing to stop it. David Gamut bravely sang hymns to stop the Indians attacking him and the Monroe sisters. But suddenly Magua appeared before them.
"Come and be my wife,"
he called to Cora, and Alice fainted.
Never,
cried Cora. Clever Magua then picked up Alice's body and ran with her towards the forest. Cora followed. Gamut came after her, still singing his hymns. The Hurons thought he was crazy and let him walk past freely. At the forest's edge, Magua took the sisters to 2 horses. He pushed Alice over the back of one, and Cora got up with her. He led the horse into the forest. Gamut, who wasn't far behind, got on the second horse and rode after them. Chapter 6. Tracks from the Battlefield. 3 days after the terrible massacre at Fort William Henry, about an hour before the sun went down, 5 figures crossed the empty battleground, now silent and still. The two in front, Uncas and Chingachgook, looked all around them as they moved forwards. They were followed by Hawkeye, Hayward, and Monroe. These last two had taken off their British Army uniforms and heavy boots. They were now dressed in the soft leather jackets and trousers and the light moccasins of scouts. It was a dangerous business which they had in front of them, following the French army as it marched north. Fort William Henry was now nothing but a black, smoking ruin. The French had not wished to capture and keep it, only to destroy it after taking it. They hoped in this way to stop the British from using the fort in the future as a useful place from which to push northwards into Canada. Slowly the 5 figures moved across the grim battlefield, looking at the many lifeless bodies of women and children that still lay where they had fallen. They were searching for Cora and Alice, but they did not find them amongst the dead. Then Uncas found something caught on the branch of a tree. It was a small piece of green scarf, just like the one Cora usually wore. Hayward and Monroe went over to look.
Many thanks, my friends,
cried Monroe.
My daughters left the battle alive then, but where have they gone since?
Chingachgook followed some tracks which led into the forest, and the others came after him. Suddenly he pointed down at something. There was a moccasin shape in the soft ground. Hayward came nearer and looked where Chingachgook was pointing.
So they were prisoners,
he said. Uncas now got on his hands and knees and looked closely at the shape in the soft ground. Indians can read moccasin tracks better than white men.
Well, boy,
asked Hawkeye,
whose is it?
Uncas looked up.
Magua,
he said, and Chingachgook agreed.
So Magua took Cora this way,
added Hawkeye.
But not Alice?
Asked Hayward. Then they found Gamut's hymn book on the ground.
So that good man went with them too,
said Hayward. A little way into the forest, they saw the tracks of the horses, and at last they found something to tell them that Alice, too, had passed that way. One of her earrings. Hayward picked it up quietly and put it in his pocket, and Monroe cried, thinking of his 2 poor daughters in Magua's hands. Because Monroe was so weak with worry, the 5 stayed that evening in the ruins of the fort. After a light supper of dry bear meat, Monroe went to sleep immediately, but Hayward and the others stayed awake to guard the place. In the middle of the night, they heard something moving amongst the dead bodies on the battlefield.
Wolves, perhaps, looking for food,
said Hayward.
I'm not so sure of that,
said Hawkeye, and he called Uncas to him. The 2 men talked briefly together, and then Uncas took a rifle and crawled off. Chingachgook sat calmly by the fire. You couldn't tell that he believed that there were Hurons out on the battlefield. Suddenly, there was a rifle shot, and the old Mohican threw himself to the ground. The bullet missed him by inches and hit the wall of the fort just behind him. Then there was another shot out on the battlefield. Soon after that, Uncas returned.
Hurons?
Asked Hawkeye.
1,
replied Uncas, lifting up one finger as he spoke. Chingachgook, Uncas, and Hawkeye now sat in a circle near the fire. They lit a pipe and smoked as they spoke of what to do the next day. Hayward watched them with interest. At first, Uncas and Chingachgook wanted to follow Magua and his prisoners on foot, but after a lot of talking and smoking, Hawkeye persuaded them to travel by canoe across the lake. After an hour, they finished their conversation and lay down to sleep. Hayward was not long in following their example. The stars were still in the sky when Hawkeye woke them early the next morning. Hayward and Monroe followed him down to the lake and got into the canoe. Uncas and Chingachgook were already there, ready to paddle away. Hawkeye got in last, and they left, steering across the beautiful waters of the lake. As the sun came up, they found themselves at the narrow part of the lake, with lots of small islands in their path. This was the path that Montcalm had taken to return to the north. Perhaps he had left some of his men behind to guard his back, so Uncas and Chingachgook paddled forwards slowly, careful of possible danger. As they got near to one small island, Chingachgook pointed. There was gray smoke above the trees.
Someone's lit a fire,
said Hawkeye.
But there can't be many of them.
Then let us attack,
said Hayward. But he spoke a little too loudly, and suddenly there came a rifle shot from the island, and 2 canoes pushed into the water, each full of Huron fighters. Chingachgook and Uncas paddled off, faster than the wind, between 2 other rocky islands. Then Hawkeye gave his paddle to Hayward and picked up his rifle from the bottom of the canoe.
Start paddling, Hayward,
he shouted,
while I see if my rifle, Killdeer, can reach them.
As their canoe flew across the lake, Hawkeye lifted his rifle to his eye to shoot at the leader of the Hurons in the canoe that was following them. But a cry from Uncas stopped him. Looking forward, the scout at once saw why he had cried out. A 3rd Huron canoe had come from one of the islands in front of them and was cutting across their path. Uncas and Chingachgook steered the boat quickly around a long, low island, and the canoe in front had to slow down in order to steer along the other side of the island. Hawkeye lifted his rifle again and shot at the Huron in the front of the canoe, who fell back, dying. As the Hurons did not have rifles that could reach as far as Killdeer, and as none of them could paddle as fast as the 2 Mohicans, they gave up their chase. Sometime later, Hawkeye, the Mohicans, Hayward, and Monroe landed at the edge of the lake, hid their canoe carefully under some bushes, picked up their bags and their guns, and walked off into the forest. Chapter 7. Into the Huron Camp. Once they had left their canoe, Hawkeye, the 2 Mohicans, Hayward, and Monroe traveled on overland. They were crossing that wild country of valleys and mountains that stands between Lake Champlain and the Springs, where the Hudson, Mohawk, and St. Lawrence rivers begin. After their day's journey, they lit a fire, ate, and then slept. They woke early next morning and continued northwards. Hawkeye looked around for the tracks of Magua and his prisoners, but without success.
Well,
he said,
I'm sure they came this way, but where?
Uncas pointed to some tracks a little higher up the hill.
Horses went this way,
he said.
Dark hair goes north.
They followed the prints left by the horses until they found a place where Magua had stopped. Black pieces of wood lay on the ground, all that was left of a fire, and there were tracks all around. Not far away, they found the 2 riderless horses eating grass. They were dirty and had clearly been left to go free a day or 2 before.
Not far to go,
said Hawkeye.
We must be in enemy country.
Uncas found another track, made by a big man in moccasins.
Gamut,
said Hawkeye, after looking at the prints.
But where are the others' tracks?
Asked Hayward.
I'm sure Magua made the young ladies put their feet where the singer had stepped,
said Hawkeye.
An old Indian trick.
He was right. Later, the Monroe sisters' prints appeared next to Gamut's tracks.
My poor girls,
said General Monroe, looking sadly down at the small prints.
Will they survive in this wild place?
Oh, yes. They are strong enough. But looking at the singing teacher's tracks, I can see that he is tired and weak now.
They followed the tracks until they came to a lake. Then they decided to explore in groups. Uncas and Chingachgook went one way, Hawkeye and Monroe a second way, and Hayward a third. The light was going, and it was difficult to see, but to Hayward's eyes, there seemed to be a group of low, round buildings at the water's edge, and dark shapes, like Indians on their hands and knees, were moving between them. Hayward was going to give a bird call to warn the others when he suddenly saw the figure of an Indian in the darkness nearby. Hayward stood watching and waiting. The Indian had 4 feathers in his hair, and thick paint covered his face. He wore moccasins on his feet, had a shirt tied around his middle, and a cloak over his shoulders. Suddenly, Hawkeye appeared at Hayward's side. Hayward pointed to the unknown Indian and whispered to the scout.
Look over there. We can't move freely with him watching.
Hawkeye studied the tall figure.
He isn't a Huron,
he said.
That's for sure. In fact, I don't recognize which of the Canadian tribes he comes from.
Well, he isn't carrying a rifle or a knife, so if he doesn't call to his Indian friends in the village by the lake, he isn't a danger.
His Indian friends,
said Hawkeye, laughing to himself.
Well, I think I'll go and get a closer look at him. Keep your rifle ready, but don't shoot until I say.
Hawkeye moved closer and closer to the strange figure, and soon stood behind him. Hawkeye lifted his hands, ready to catch the man by the shoulders, when suddenly there came a loud noise of something hitting the water. The dark shapes disappeared into the lake and swam off. Hawkeye dropped his hands and laughed.
What mistakes a man can make,
he laughed.
You're no Indian,
he said to the figure.
But our old friend, Mr. Gamut. And that Indian village by the lake,
he said, turning to Hayward,
is no home for Indians, but a place built by beavers.
Then Hawkeye gave a bird call, and the Mohicans and Monroe came back from the lake towards them.
We found the singing teacher waiting to teach the beavers a hymn or two, and dressed as a Huron.
Hawkeye explained once they had arrived.
And Cora and Alice?
Asked Hayward quickly.
They are prisoners of the Indians,
replied Gamut.
But they are well, and they are unhurt.
Thank goodness,
cried Monroe.
Oh, my poor dear daughters.
Gamut then told them of his journey. Magua had not chased him away, because like most Indians, he would not touch anyone who was crazy, believing that they were specially cared for by the Great Spirit.
And where is Magua now?
Asked Hawkeye.
He is hunting today with his men. They are looking for moose. And tomorrow they will go north through the forest towards Canada.
And my daughters?
Asked Monroe.
Cora is with a tribe who live beyond that mountain over there, and Alice is with the Huron women, not far from here.
But why are you not guarded?
Asked Hawkeye.
I am only a singer. They do not worry where I go.
But why did you not escape and go back to Fort Edward?
And leave the sisters with the Indians?
Asked Gamut.
So Cora is with a tribe just past that mountain,
said Hayward.
Yes,
said Gamut.
I don't remember their name, but they are friends of the French.
Tell us about them,
said Hawkeye, and Uncas and Chingachgook listened carefully.
Did you see the totems of the tribe?
Well,
said Gamut,
they had strange pictures painted on them. One was a terrible, huge tortoise.
Delawares,
said Chingachgook.
Interesting,
added Hawkeye.
Delawares and Mohicans come from the same great Indian family. Chingachgook is a great chief of the tortoises. If Cora is with the Delawares, that could be very useful.
What are we waiting for? Let's save Cora and Alice at once,
said Hayward.
Well,
said Hawkeye,
I think we should let the singing teacher go and tell the sisters about us. He can go here and there without any problem.
Paint me so that no one will recognize me,
said Hayward.
I'll pretend to be a crazy French actor from a traveling theater group. You go to the Delawares and save Cora, and I'll go with Gamut to save Alice.
So they painted Hayward's face, and soon he was ready. Before he left with Gamut, Hawkeye talked to him.
Monroe's weak and confused. I leave him here with Chingachgook while Uncas and I go to the Delawares.
So Hayward and Gamut walked off past the Beaver Lake. After some time, they reached the Huron camp, where they saw a group of boys playing in the long grass. The children stopped their games and hid in the grass when they saw their visitors getting closer. Their cries brought several adult Indians to the door of the nearest long wooden hut. Gamut, of course, was known to the Hurons and used to their ways. He walked to the long hut and entered it. Hayward followed. They both sat on the floor of the hut, which was dark, except for the light of a burning torch. 3 Huron chiefs sat opposite, and several Hurons stood near them, listening and watching, waiting for their visitors to speak. At last, one of the old chiefs spoke to them in Huron.
"Does anyone speak French?"
answered Hayward in that language.
What does Montcalm, our Canadian father, say to the Hurons who killed the English 5 days ago?
Asked one of the old chiefs in French.
"I imagine he is pleased and says the Hurons are brave."
No, he turns his back on us and looks behind him.
"He looks to see no enemies are following, perhaps."
The English are dead,
went on the chief.
But he opens his ears to the Delawares. They tell him lies about us.
"This cannot be,"
said Hayward, changing his plan.
"He sends me, a medicine man, to help any Hurons who are ill."
A medicine man? Then why is your face covered in paint? Your kind of medicine men have white faces.
When an Indian chief goes to speak to his white fathers, he wears the shirt that they offer him. My brother gave me paint, and I wear it.
They seemed pleased with this reply, but suddenly the calm was broken by some Huron fighters noisily returning to the village after a fight with a neighboring tribe. With the other Indians, Hayward left the hut to see what was happening. A group of Huron men stood there with 2 prisoners. One was a Huron, and the other was Uncas, the Mohican. Suddenly, Uncas broke free and bravely tried to escape. Hayward put out his foot, and the Huron who was running closely behind Uncas tripped over it. But, in the end, they caught the Mohican and brought him, together with the Huron prisoner, into the long hut.
Delaware,
said the Huron chief to Uncas.
2 of our men are chasing the White Scout, your friend. When they catch him, we will take you both to our wise men, who will say if you must live or die.
I heard 2 shots from my friend's rifle,
replied Uncas.
Perhaps your men will not come back.
If the Delawares are so clever, why are you here as prisoner?
I ran after this man,
said Uncas, pointing at the Huron prisoner.
And like a coward, he ran from me. I was caught by a trick.
An old woman now came close, holding a wooden torch. She looked at Uncas. He looked back at her, unafraid. She then looked at the Huron, who shook in front of her.
Shaking Reed,
said the old woman.
You are good-looking, but in battle you are a coward, and you must die.
She drove a knife into the shaking Huron's heart, throwing her torch to the ground. Darkness filled the hut. Chapter 8. A Bear to the Rescue. When the torch hit the floor and went out, all the Indians in the hut, it seemed, ran outside. Hayward thought he was alone in the hut with the dead Huron. But just then, Uncas came close and spoke to him.
Go,
he said, and pushed him to the door of the hut. Hayward went out. He looked into some of the nearby huts to see if he could find Alice, but without success. Then he turned to look for the singing teacher, but Gamut was nowhere to be seen. So Hayward returned to the long hut with the other Indians. A torch burnt in the place again, and Hayward sat down. Uncas stood in the middle of the hut, as before. Then one of the older Hurons spoke to Hayward.
An evil spirit lives in the wife of one of my young men. Can you frighten it away?
I will try,
replied Hayward. Just then, a Huron warrior entered and sat down next to Hayward. It was Magua. The Hurons now lit a pipe, which they passed between them.
Welcome, Magua,
said an old chief.
How was the hunting?
We killed many moose. My men are bringing them to the village now. If Shaking Reed walks along the hunting path, he will meet them.
They all fell silent when they heard the dead Huron's name. Shaking Reed's father spoke.
Shaking Reed was a coward. His blood was pale, and he is forgotten. He was no Huron. The Great Spirit has decided that my family should end with me.
Grimly, the old man left the hut.
Delawares have been here,
said another of the chiefs to Magua.
but we Hurons do not sleep.
Delawares?
Cried Magua angrily.
Did you kill them?
No, but one of them is our prisoner,
said the old chief, pointing at the young warrior, who still stood without moving in the middle of the hut. Magua got up and went over to look at the prisoner. The Mohican stared back at him, a grim look on his face. Magua's face filled with a look of evil victory.
Uncas!
He cried. All the Indians in the hut cried out when they heard the name of their most hated enemy. The prisoners smiled to see that he was so well known.
Mohican, you die,
said Magua in English. Then he told the other Hurons about the fight at Glenn's waterfall and the death of so many fine Huron warriors. He told them about Hawkeye's attack and how that had ended.
We killed many English,
he finished.
But the only way to pay for our Huron dead is with Indian blood. So we should kill this Mohican.
All the Hurons in the hut were hungry for blood by now, and one tried to attack Uncas there and then with his tomahawk, but Magua stopped him. Hayward watched all this, helpless, not knowing what to do.
Be patient, my brothers,
said Magua.
We mustn't kill him quickly tonight. No, let him die tomorrow under the strong light of the sun, with all our women there to see his body shake like the coward that he is.
Several Hurons came forward, tied Uncas's arms behind his back, and marched him from the long hut into a smaller prison hut next door. Once they had thrown the Mohican inside, 5 of them stood outside to guard the place. Now the chief who had asked for Hayward's help with the sick woman stood up and asked the white medicine man to go with him. Hayward followed him into the night. They crossed the village and went towards a nearby hill. Suddenly, in their path, they saw the dark figure of a bear. The Huron chief walked past the animal without fear. Hayward decided that it was probably a bear which belonged to the tribe. As they passed it, the bear began to follow Hayward, and he felt uncomfortable, especially as it began to growl. Finally, they reached the hillside, where the old chief opened a wooden door, and they entered a cave. Still, the bear followed. The cave that they went into was under the hill, and there were a number of smaller rooms joined by passages. The chief led Hayward into one of these rooms, where the sick woman lay on a bed, with several Huron women around her. In the middle of these women was Gamut, the singing teacher. He began to sing a beautiful hymn, and at once the bear joined him, growling with the music. Suddenly Gamut stopped and said to Hayward,
"The woman you are searching for is near."
Then he left the cave. Hayward went to the Huron woman lying on her bed. One look was enough to tell him that she was very ill indeed. Again the bear growled, and every time Hayward moved towards her, he growled again.
Our bear wants us to leave. Some things must stay secret,
said the old chief.
Come, you women. Let us leave this white man to make a strong medicine that will help our sister, who is so ill.
The chief led the women from the cave, and Hayward found himself alone with the sick woman and the bear. The animal came close to Hayward, lifted its paws up to its head, and pulled it off. Hayward's mouth fell open. Then, under the bear's head, he was pleased to see the well-known face of his old friend, Hawkeye.
Don't make a noise,
said the scout.
There are Hurons near.
But how did you get here?
Asked Hayward in a low voice.
Well, I left Chingachgook and Old Monroe hidden safely in one of the empty beavers' houses, and then Uncas and I went off to the village of the Delawares. On the way, we met a group of Hurons and fought them. Uncas ran off after one of them, and that was the last I saw of him.
He was brought here as a prisoner,
said Hayward.
I saw him arrive, but could do nothing to help him.
I thought that he was a prisoner,
said Hawkeye.
That's why I came here.
But what about your bear suit?
Well, after shooting the rest of the Hurons, I came to this village and passed the hut where the medicine man lives. I hit him over the head, tied him up, gagged him, and got into his bear suit. But where's Alice?
I don't know. I couldn't find her.
Don't you remember what Gamut said? The woman you are looking for is near. Didn't you understand? I believe he meant that Alice is here, in one of the rooms in this cave.
Then I must go to her at once,
cried Hayward.
Wait,
said Hawkeye.
Take off that face paint first. You don't want to frighten the girl. We can paint you again later.
Hayward cleaned the paint off his face and went to look for Alice. He soon found her in a nearby room.
There's no time now to tell you everything,
he said.
But we must leave this cave and find your father. He's weak and confused now. But before he became ill, I told him about my feelings for you, and he agreed to you marrying me. What do you say?
Oh, Duncan,
replied Alice quietly.
This is not a time to talk of things like that. Take me to my father first.
Hayward was going to reply when he was interrupted by a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find the evil Magua standing in front of him. He had come into the cave by a different door, and he now closed it and put sticks and stones in front of it so that it could not easily be opened again.
Palefaces catch beavers, but Hurons catch English,
he laughed. Seeing Magua so close, Alice fainted and fell to the floor. Then the bear, with its head in place, appeared and began to growl. Magua thought it was the medicine man and said,
Fool, go to the women and children. This is men's work.
The bear stood up, its paws in the air, and came towards Magua. Suddenly it put its arms round him and held him close. Hayward immediately tied his wrists and ankles with rope and gagged him. After that, Hayward and Hawkeye carried Alice to the room where the sick woman lay. They took the blanket from her bed and put it over Alice. Then Hayward picked her up, and Hawkeye explained his plan.
Tell the Hurons that the evil spirit has gone from the sick woman, but that you want to take her into the forest to give her some different medicines.
They went outside to the chief and the Huron women.
How is my wife?
Asked the woman's worried husband.
The spirit has left her and is a prisoner in the rocks, so you mustn't enter the cave,
said Hayward.
We are now going to the forest for medicine and will return later.
So Hawkeye, Hayward, and Alice reached the forest. At its edge, Hawkeye told the others the way to the Delaware village.
Now I must rescue Uncas,
he said, and he returned to the Huron village. Once there, he went to a little old hut where he heard Gamut singing. He went straight in, and Gamut stared at him.
Don't you know me?
Asked Hawkeye, who was still in the bear suit.
It's me, Hawkeye. We must rescue Uncas. Take me to his hut.
Gamut led Hawkeye to the prison hut, where one of the guards spoke English. He explained that the medicine man wanted to blow on the prisoner to make sure, by magic, that he was a shaking coward the next day. The guards let them pass and moved away. They didn't want to be blown on. In the hut, Hawkeye untied Uncas and took off his bear suit.
Put this on,
he said to the Mohican.
Now, Mr. Singing Teacher, we must exchange clothes. You take my leather jacket and trousers, and I'll take your hat and your cloak.
Uncas quickly got into the bear suit, while Gamut and Hawkeye put on their new clothes. Then Hawkeye spoke to Gamut.
You must lie down and pretend to be Uncas. When they find you, the Hurons will be angry, but you'll be safe, because they think the Great Spirit protects you. Will you help us? Of course,
said Gamut, and he lay on the floor. Hawkeye and Uncas left the hut with no problem. They were walking into the forest when suddenly they heard a cry from the Huron village. Uncas took off the bear suit, and Hawkeye pulled 2 rifles from under a bush.
Now we are ready for them,
said the scout. Chapter 9. Magua, Huron Chief. After some time, the Huron guards who were standing near Uncas's prison hut decided that they were no longer afraid of the medicine man's magic. They came closer and looked in through the door at their prisoner. At first, Gamut had his back to them and his feet pulled up, and they believed he was Uncas. But then he straightened his legs and turned, and they saw his face. At once they realized the trick which the singer and the others had played on them, and they were very angry. But when Gamut started singing, to stop himself from becoming frightened, they remembered that he was a fool. Instead of attacking him, they ran through the village and warned the others in their tribe of their prisoner's escape. Soon 200 Hurons were awake, and they began to run towards the long hut to discover what had happened. They looked around for Magua, but could find him nowhere. Some of the fastest warriors went to make sure that their enemies, the Delaware, were not attacking the village. Women and children ran about here and there, and the whole place was full of noise and hurried steps. At last the old chiefs arrived, took their places in the middle of the long council hut, and began to talk together in low voices. Then, suddenly, a group of Indians arrived with the village medicine man. He told them briefly how someone had hit him on the head and stolen his bear suit. Then the father of the sick woman told his story, and he and 10 Hurons went off to the caves to see what they could find there. When they entered the place, they found the sick woman still on her bed, although many thought that they had seen the white man carry her to the forest. Then the woman's father looked at her and saw that she was dead.
"The Great Spirit is angry with us,"
he cried. One of the older Indians was going to reply when something long and dark rolled out of the next room in the cave into the middle of the room where they were standing. For a moment, no one knew what it was, but when it sat up and they could see its angry face, they realized that it was Magua. Several warriors stepped forwards and cut the ropes around his ankles and wrists, and the gag that stopped his mouth. Magua stood up, and an angry light shone from his eyes. It was lucky for them that Hawkeye and Hayward were nowhere near him at that moment. Then an old chief spoke.
"You have an enemy. Tell us where he is, and we will kill him for you."
"Let the Mohican die."
There was a moment of silence, and then the same old chief replied.
"He runs fast, but my young men run after him."
"Has he escaped?"
asked Magua in a shocked voice.
"An evil spirit came among us and closed our eyes to what was happening,"
replied the old man.
"That was no evil spirit. It was Long Rifle."
Many Hurons cried out at once when they heard that name, so hateful to their ears.
"Let us go to the council hut,"
said Magua. He then led them to the long hut. When they were all in their places, they looked at Magua, and he began to speak. He told the story of what had happened to him in the cave. Hawkeye's trick was now fully explained to the whole tribe. The Indians in the council hut were now angry and ready to listen to more of Magua's evil words. He cleverly worked on them, persuading them that it was time to attack their enemies and that they would have a great victory. They all agreed with him, and it was decided that Magua himself should be the chief who would lead them in this battle. This was a great moment for Magua, for by luck and cleverness, he had now managed to get back all that he had lost when he left his tribe all those years before to work for the British. He had once sent spies to the Delaware village and ordered his warriors to go to their huts, telling them to make themselves ready. Then he went to his own hut to prepare himself. Before the sun came up the next day, 20 Indians came to Magua. They carried rifles, but for the moment the paint on their faces spoke of peace, not war. Magua led them out of the village and past the lake. One of the Hurons had the beaver as his totem, so he stopped and spoke to these animals.
"Cousins," he
said in a friendly voice,
"we protect you from the hunters, and we will go on protecting you, so be grateful. Now, help us. We are going to visit our old enemies, the Delawares, to see if Long Rifle and the Mohican Uncas are hiding with them. Give us your cleverness, and help our tongues to work well when we speak to the Delaware chief."
In this way, he spoke to his cousins, the beavers, and he was happy to see their dark heads appear from time to time above the water as they swam around in the lake. When he finished speaking, he also saw a large beaver head look out briefly at him from a large old ruined lodge which he had thought was empty. This seemed to him a very lucky sign. The Hurons marched on towards the village of the Delawares. Nobody looked behind them, and nobody saw the big dark head again stare out from the door of the old beaver's lodge and watch them. It seemed strangely intelligent. Then, when the Hurons entered the forest, all was explained. Now Magua and the others were gone. A man in a beaver's mask crawled out of the ruined lodge. It was Chingachgook. The Delawares were allies of the French, and, like the Hurons, they had followed Montcalm into British lands. But when the French had most needed their help, the Delawares had refused it. When Montcalm sent messages to them, the Delaware chiefs replied that their tomahawks could no longer cut well, and that they needed time to make them bright and sharp again. The French had decided that it was better to keep the Delawares as allies who were not helping them, and not make them into enemies who were fighting against them. So they left things as they were. When the sun came up over the Delaware village, it shone down on a busy place. The women ran from hut to hut. Some were preparing the morning meal. Others exchanged hurried, whispered conversations with their sisters. The warriors sat around, talking. Rifles stood ready for the hunt, but no one went hunting, and here and there a man was cleaning his gun in a way which was strange when there were no enemies except wild animals. From time to time, one or another of the Delawares looked towards a large hut in the middle of the village. It seemed to contain something important for them. Into this scene came a figure. He appeared on a high rock at the edge of the village, lifted his arm to the sky, and then put his hand on his chest in a sign of peace. The Delawares saw the sign and welcomed him. He climbed down from the rock and walked into the middle of the huts, with many signs of peace to the Delawares whom he met on the way. Silently he walked towards the Delaware chiefs. When he got close, they saw that he was Magua, the Huron chief.
"Welcome,"
said Chief Hardheart, as he and Magua shook hands. After this, the Delaware invited the Huron to his hut to eat breakfast with him, and Magua accepted the invitation. Once the short meal was finished, the two began talking again.
"Your tomahawks have been red with blood,"
said Hardheart.
"But now they are clean and no longer sharp,"
replied Magua.
"The English are dead, and the Delawares are our neighbors."
Hardheart lifted his hand in a sign of peace, but said nothing.
"Does my prisoner give you trouble?"
continued the Huron.
"She is welcome,"
replied the Delaware. Magua said nothing for a while, and then he asked,
"Have my Delaware brothers seen white men near their village?"
There was no answer. Magua took out some necklaces, earrings, and rings, which his men had taken from the dead bodies of English women after the massacre at Fort William Henry. He gave them to the Delaware chief and his warriors. Hardheart became more friendly, and Magua repeated his question.
Has my brother seen strange moccasins in the forest?
Yes, and they have come here,
replied Hardheart.
The Delaware do not close their doors to any man or woman.
So you have Long Rifle with you then?
Said Magua. All the Delawares looked surprised to hear that this well-known enemy of France was in their camp. They called a meeting at their council hut, and 3 old chiefs came to lead it. The oldest of these was the great chief Tamenund. Then from the hut in the middle of the village, the Monroe sisters, Hayward and Hawkeye, were brought out.
Which of them is Long Rifle?
Asked a chief.
I am,
said Hayward. But Magua pointed at Hawkeye. Chief Tamenund asked,
What brings a Huron to our camp?
I come to take back what is mine,
replied Magua. Cora now turned to Tamenund and asked,
Is Tamenund a father?
Tamenund smiled a great smile.
Of a whole tribe.
I ask nothing for myself. My mother's great-grandparents lived through hard times, like your people,
continued Cora.
But please, as a father, send my sister back to her father, who is old and sick, and who misses his daughter greatly.
White men think that all the land is theirs,
replied Tamenund.
They think that Indians are less than dogs. They prefer their women to be white, like the snow. But I say their time here will end one day, as winter changes to spring.
What you say is true,
replied Cora.
But wait, you have not heard the words of the last of your prisoners, one of your own tribe. Let him come and speak to you before you agree to give Magua what he asks for.
Bring this man before us,
ordered Tamenund. Chapter 10. To the Happy Hunting Ground. Uncas was brought out of the prison hut and taken to the great chief Tamenund. The whole Delaware tribe stood in a big circle watching him.
What language do you speak?
Asked Tamenund.
Delaware, like my father and his father,
answered Uncas.
Why do you crawl like a snake into the Delaware camp?
Another chief spoke.
He is a dog that follows English paths.
And you are dogs that eat French food,
replied Uncas, looking grimly around him. Many warriors jumped up at these words, but Tamenund made a sign to stay calm.
Delaware,
he continued,
a warrior who leaves his tribe, and leaves it during hard times, is an evil man twice over. My children, he is yours.
Many of the warriors ran forward to throw Uncas into the great fire that burned nearby. Hayward tried to go to his friend. Hawkeye looked grim. And Cora threw herself at Tamenund's feet, asking him to save Uncas's life. The Mohican stayed calm, even when a Delaware warrior pulled off his shirt. But immediately the Delawares stared at Uncas's chest and pointed to the blue tortoise on it.
Who are you?
Asked Tamenund.
Uncas, Jumping Deer, son of Chingachgook, the great snake.
I had a friend called Uncas when I was young. He was a great chief,
said Tamenund.
I am the great-grandson of that man,
explained Uncas.
But all the Mohicans are dead now, except me and my father.
It is true,
said Tamenund.
Our wise men told us many stories of Mohicans in English lands, and now at last you have come home to our council hut.
Uncas now went and cut the ropes round Hawkeye's wrists with his own knife. Then he led the scout to Tamenund.
Great father,
he said,
this man is a good friend.
But he is Long Rifle, who has killed so many of our kind.
Hurons, yes, but never Delawares,
said Hawkeye.
If I am welcome here,
said Uncas,
so is my friend.
Where is the Huron who told me so many lies?
Asked Tamenund. Magua stood up.
You will not keep what is mine,
he said. Tamenund turned to Uncas.
Tell me, my son, do you and Hawkeye belong to this man?
No, my father. I was caught by a trick.
And what of the white man and the pale woman he cares for?
Asked Tamenund.
They should travel on an open path. She was rescued fairly.
And the woman Magua left here, is she his?
Uncas said nothing, but turned away sadly.
My son is silent.
It is true,
said Uncas in a low voice. Then Tamenund turned to Magua.
Go, Huron,
he said.
With empty hands, or with the woman I brought here as my wife?
Tamenund looked at Cora.
What do you wish? He is a brave warrior and a great chief of his people. Will you go with him? Will you have his children?
No, I would prefer to die than to go with him.
Magua, she refuses. Your hut will not be a happy place.
Is Tamenund honest? Will he give Magua what he brought here?
Asked the Huron.
Go then,
said Tamenund.
Take what is yours.
Magua took Cora by the wrist and began to drag her after him. The Delawares stood back to let him pass.
Wait,
cried Hayward.
Leave her and take instead gold, silver, bullets, rifles. All that you need to be a great chief.
Magua is strong,
cried the Huron, shaking Cora by the wrist.
This is his revenge on Monroe.
One moment there,
cried Hawkeye.
Take me instead of the girl, and you could have my rifle Killdeer, too.
Magua seemed almost persuaded to accept what Hawkeye offered. But, looking again at Cora, he said,
Magua's plans do not change so easily.
Then Uncas spoke.
Tamenund's word is the law. The sun is in the tree branches, Huron, and you are free to go now with the woman. But when the sun is above the trees, there will be men on your tracks.
Magua laughed at Uncas's words, and turning his back, dragged Cora out of the Delawares' camp and back towards his own village. The Delawares watched them go grimly. Once Magua and Cora had disappeared, the Delaware camp became very busy indeed. Uncas put on war paint and led the other Delaware men in a war dance. Fighter after fighter came to join the dance until all the warriors in the camp were there. When at last the sun reached above the trees, and the time of the truce with Magua was over, all the Delaware men were ready to follow the Mohican in his attack on the Hurons. While Tamenund said goodbye to Uncas and his followers, Hayward and Hawkeye left Alice in a safe place in the Delaware camp with the women and children. Then, with Hayward and Hawkeye at Uncas's side, 200 Delaware fighters made their way into the forest, where they attacked the Huron gunmen they found hiding there. Most of the Hurons ran off when they realized that their hiding place had been discovered. After that, Uncas and the Delawares had a quick war council. Uncas divided his men into different groups under different chiefs. Hawkeye was given a group to command, and Hayward chose to fight by the scouts' side. Then the war council discussed the best way to go on. Uncas wanted to advance quickly, but the other chiefs were against hurrying. The meeting was interrupted when the Delawares noticed a man walking from the forest towards them. He seemed to be a Huron scout who had been sent to make peace.
Kill him,
said Uncas to Hawkeye. The scout lifted Killdeer to his eye and then let his rifle fall again and laughed.
It's the singing teacher.
Hawkeye put down his rifle and crawled through the bushes until he was close to the man. There he sang a few notes of an English hymn to tell Gamut that he was among friends. After that, he stepped out from behind the bushes and brought the singing teacher back to speak to the war council.
The Hurons, with Magua at their head, are hiding in great numbers deep in the forest.
Gamut explained when Hawkeye questioned him.
And Cora is a prisoner in the cave.
The cave. Then we must rescue her at once,
cried Hayward. Uncas looked at Hawkeye.
Give me 20 men,
said the scout,
and I'll go to the right, along by the stream, and past the Beaver's Lake. We'll get Monroe and Chingachgook from the Beaver's Lodge, and then attack the Hurons on the right. At the same time, you, Uncas, must attack Magua from the front. Then we'll hurry on, attack the village, and rescue Cora from the cave.
They explained the plan to the different Delaware chiefs, and Hawkeye led his men off. He had not gone far before he realized that the singing teacher had come with them.
What are you doing here without a rifle?
Asked Hawkeye.
I have my catapult,
said Gamut, bringing one out of his pocket.
And I'll use that to help Cora.
Very well,
agreed Hawkeye.
You can come with us and use your catapult. But no singing, remember?
Hawkeye led his men along the dry bed of a river until a stream of running water crossed their path. Now, he decided, was the time to enter the forest. But as soon as Hawkeye's men appeared above the riverbank, they were met by a rain of Huron bullets, killing one of their men.
Behind the trees, quick!
Cried Hawkeye, and they all obeyed him. There was a long exchange of shots between the two sides. Then, some Hurons moved forwards and to the left, hoping to surround the Delawares. The situation was serious for Hawkeye's men. The trees no longer protected them. Suddenly, they heard shots from Uncas's part of the forest, and the Hurons who were attacking them turned, confused. Hawkeye and his men immediately advanced, killing all the Hurons that they could. Soon after this, rifle shots came from Chingachgook and Monroe at the Beaver's Lake. Shocked by this, the Hurons who were left ran off into the forest. Chingachgook and Monroe joined Hawkeye, Hayward, and the rest, and they hurried to the center of the forest to make a quick attack on the Hurons' right, while Uncas attacked from the front. Uncas, who had seen Magua in the battle, ran forward to attack him, but the Huron chief turned and hurried away from the battlefield. So the Delawares advanced, and soon the battle reached the Huron village. There was a fierce fight in front of the council hut, and the ground was quickly covered with Huron dead. Magua now ran off with 2 Huron warriors towards the cave. Uncas ran after him at once, and he was followed by Hawkeye, Hayward, and Gamut. It was difficult for the rescuers to see as they hurried along the cave's dark passages. But suddenly a white dress appeared in the darkness.
It's Cora,
cried Hayward, and they ran on faster than ever. Now their path lay up a slope, and the Hurons shot back down at them. At last, they could see 4 dark figures standing for a moment against the sky above them. Magua was escaping through a cave entrance high up on the other side of the mountain. With a growl, Uncas ran out after him.
Stop, Magua!
He called, shaking his tomahawk angrily. Cora, Magua, and the 2 Hurons were now on a high rock ledge. They had no more bullets left.
I will go no higher,
cried Cora as she looked down the mountain.
Kill me if you must, but I will stop here.
The Huron chief pulled out his knife.
Choose, woman, my knife or my bed,
he growled. Cora fell to her knees in front of Magua, and he lifted his knife in the air to stab her to death. But at that moment, with a loud cry, Uncas jumped onto the ledge in front of him. Magua stepped back, and one of the other Hurons stabbed Cora in the heart. Now Magua drove his knife into Uncas's back. Then, as the Mohican tried to stand, Magua stabbed him again and again in the chest, until he fell back, dead. When Hayward and Hawkeye reached the ledge, Magua and his 2 warriors had already left, and Cora and Uncas lay dead before them. Hawkeye, now thirsty for revenge, saw something moving higher up on the mountain and lifted his rifle to shoot. But it was only Gamut, who was dropping a large rock on one of the Hurons' heads below him. Then Magua jumped out from a narrow space between 2 rocks pushing the other Huron to his death on the rocks far below. He was trying to escape by jumping across a wide empty space from one rock ledge to another. But the second ledge was too far away, and his feet didn't land on it as he had planned. Now his moccasins were touching empty air, and he held on with both hands to a mountain bush to stop himself from falling. With a grim face, the scout lifted Killdeer to his eye and shot Magua in the back. The Huron chief fell like a stone to the ground below. The next day was black for the Delawares. They had won the war and had burnt the Huron village to the ground, but their hearts were heavy. They sang no victory songs. Instead, they mourned. The whole tribe, men, women, and children, stood in a circle in the middle of their camp. In the center of this circle lay the dead Cora on a bed of sweet-smelling flowers. Indian blankets covered her, and 6 young Delaware women moved around her in a slow dance of mourning. General Monroe sat at her feet, his face full of sadness, and Gamut stood by his side. Hayward stood nearby, trying hard not to show his feelings. Next to this first group was a second, even sadder than the first. Sitting, as in life, was the dead body of Uncas, wearing feathers in his hair, necklaces, earrings, and the fine clothes of a Delaware chief. He almost seemed to be living, but his face was lifeless. Chingachgook stood in front of him, his face a grim mask that gave no sign of feeling. Hawkeye stood nearby, and Tamenund was there too. As one person, the whole tribe mourned the deaths of Uncas and of Cora. First, they carried Cora's lifeless body up a small hill, where they put it deep in the earth between some trees. Gamut sang a sad song. After that, they put Uncas deep in the earth, lying with his face to the east. They covered his body with earth and leaves. Then Chingachgook spoke.
Why do my brothers mourn? Why do my sisters cry? Uncas has gone to the happy hunting ground. He was good and brave. The Great Spirit needed him and has called him away. I am left here alone, and my tribe has gone from the lake and the hills of the Delawares.
Go now, all of you,
said Tamenund.
I will not stay with you long. The time of the red man is finished, and the earth now belongs to the pale faces. This morning I saw the sons of the tortoise strong and healthy, but now I have lived to see the last of the Mohicans.